Hello there. In this video, I'll be reading Twilight Eclipse to help you get down to sleep. This is my podcast where I read audiobooks to get you the rest that you deserve, and I'm glad that you're here. I know the world can get a bit crazy sometimes, and if you're having a hard time, I just want you to know that you're very, very welcome here, and welcome to leave your burdens at the door of this podcast, and just rest with me for a while. Enjoy this story, let yourself be carried away to somewhere else, and leave all of those things behind just for the next couple of hours. You can pick back up worrying about them later on, but for now, just be here with me and enjoy this story. Give yourself permission to do that, and if you're unable to give yourself permission, I am giving you permission to do that. So let's begin. Tonight, it is the penultimate chapters of Twilight Eclipse. We're so close to the end now. I hope you've enjoyed the story so far. I've left my thoughts on this one in at the end of the episode again for our sleepy little book club that we have. These actually take place at the end of every weekly chapter that I do over on the Patreon, but I've just cut these out and put them together at the end so that they don't interrupt your story time here tonight. But of course, come and join the Patreon and hear them week to week. There is a new Twilight episode every Thursday as we currently work our way through Breaking Dawn, and then we'll be moving on to Midnight Sun. But for now, thank you so much for being here. I'd love to know where you're from in the world in a comment below this video as I tuck you in. Take a nice deep breath for me, and let's get down to sleep. With Eclipse by Stephanie Meyer. I lay face down across the sleeping bag, waiting for justice to find me. Maybe an avalanche would bury me here. I wished it would. I never wanted to see my face in the mirror again. There was no sound to warn me. Out of nowhere, Edward's cold hand stroked against my knotted hair. I shuddered guiltily at his touch. "Are you all right?" he murmured, his voice anxious. "No, I want to die." "That will never happen. I won't allow it." I groaned, and then whispered, "You might change your mind about that." "Where's Jacob?" "He went to fight," I mumbled into the floor. Jacob had left the little camp joyfully, with a cheerful, "I'll be right back," running full tilt for the clearing, already quivering as he prepared to shift to his other self. By now the whole pack knew everything. Seth Clearwater, pacing outside the tent, was an intimate witness to my disgrace. Edward was silent for a long moment. "Oh," he finally said. The tone of his voice worried me, that my avalanche wasn't coming fast enough. I peeked up at him. Sure enough, his eyes were unfocused, as he listened to something I'd rather die than have him hear. I dropped my face back to the floor. It stunned me when Edward chuckled reluctantly. "And I thought I fought dirty," he said with grudging admiration. "He makes me look like the patron saint of ethics." His hand brushed against the part of my cheek that was exposed. "I'm not mad at you, love. Jacob's more cunning than I gave him credit for. I do wish you hadn't asked him, though." "Edward, I whispered to the rough nylon. Shh," he hushed me, his fingers soothing against my cheek. "That's not what I meant. It's just that he would have kissed you anyway, even if you hadn't fallen for it. And now I don't have an excuse to break his face. I would have really enjoyed that too." "Fallen for it?" I mumbled, almost incomprehensible. "Bella, did you really believe he was that noble? That he would go out in a flame of glory just to clear the way for me?" I raised my head slowly to meet his patient gaze. His expression was soft, His eyes were full of understanding rather than revulsion that I deserved to see. Yes, I did believe that, I muttered, and then looked away. But I didn't feel any anger at Jacob for tricking me. There wasn't enough room in my body to contain anything besides the hatred I felt toward myself. Edward laughed softly again. You're such a bad liar. You'll believe anyone who has the least bit of skill. Why aren't you angry with me? I whispered. Why don't you hate me? Or haven't you heard the whole story yet? I think I got a fairly comprehensive look, he said in a light, easy voice. Jacob makes vivid mental pictures. I feel almost as bad for his pack as I do for myself. Poor Seth was getting nauseated, but Sam is making Jacob focus now. I closed my eyes and shook my head in agony. The sharp nylon fibers of the tent floor scraped against my skin. You're only human, he whispered, stroking my hair again. That's the most miserable defense I've ever heard. But you are human, Bella. And as much as I might wish otherwise, so is he. There are holes in your life that I can't fill. I understand that. But that's not true. That's what makes me so horrible. There are no holes. You love him, he murmured gently. Every cell in my body ached to deny it. I love you more, I said. It was the best I could do. Yes, I know that too. But when I left you, Bella, I left you bleeding. Jacob was the one to stitch you back up again. It was bound to leave its mark on both of you. I'm not sure those kinds of stitches dissolve on their own. I can't blame either of you for making something I made necessary. I may gain forgiveness, but that doesn't let me escape the consequences. I should have known you'd find some way to blame yourself. Please stop, I can't stand it. What would you like me to say? I want you to call me every bad name you can think of, in every language you know. I want you to tell me that you're disgusted with me, that you're going to leave so that I can beg and grovel on my knees for you to stay. I'm sorry, he sighed. I can't do that. At least stop trying to make me feel better. Let me suffer, I deserve it. No, he murmured. I nodded slowly. You're right. Keep on being too understanding. It's probably worse. He was silent for a moment, and I sensed a change in the atmosphere, a new urgency. It's getting close, I stated. Yes, a few more minutes now. Just enough time to say one more thing. I waited. When he finally spoke again, he was whispering. I can be noble, Bella. I'm not going to make you choose between us. Just be happy, and you can have whatever part of me you want, or none at all, if that's better. Don't let any debt you feel you owe me influence your decision. I pushed off the floor, shoving myself up onto my knees. Damn it, stop that, I shouted at him. His eyes widened in surprise. No, you don't understand. I'm not just trying to make you feel better, Bella. I really mean it. I know you do, I groaned. What happened to fighting back? Don't start with the noble self-sacrifice now. Fight! How? He asked, and his eyes were ancient with their sadness. I scrambled into his lap, throwing my arms around him. I don't care that it's cold here. I don't care that I stink like a dog right now. Make me forget how awful I am. Make me forget him. Make me forget my own name. Fight back. I didn't wait for him to decide, or to have the chance to tell me he wasn't interested in a cruel, faithless monster like me. I pulled myself against him and crushed my mouth to his snow-cold lips. Careful, love, he murmured under my urgent kiss. No, I growled. He gently pushed my face a few inches back. You don't have to prove anything to me. I'm not trying to prove something. You said I could have any part of you I wanted. I want this part. I want every part. I wrapped my arms around his neck and strained to reach his lips. He bent his head to kiss me back, but his cool mouth was hesitant as my impatience grew more pronounced. My body was making my intentions clear, giving me away. Inevitably, his hands moved to restrain me. Perhaps this isn't the best moment for that, he suggested, too calm for my liking. Why not? I grumbled. There was no point in fighting if he was going to be rational. I dropped my arms. Firstly, because it is cold. He reached out to pull the sleeping bag off the floor. He wrapped it around me like a blanket. Wrong, I said. First, because you're bizarrely moral for a vampire. He chuckled. All right, I'll give you that. The cold is second. And thirdly, well, you do actually stink, love. He wrinkled his nose. I sighed. Fourthly, he murmured, dropping his face so that he was whispering in my ear. We will try, Bella. I'll make good on my promise. But I'd much rather it wasn't in reaction to Jacob Black. I cringed and buried my face against his shoulder. And fifthly, this is a very long list, I muttered. He laughed. Yes, but did you want to listen to the fight or not? As he spoke, Seth howled stridently outside the tent. My body stiffened to the sound. I didn't realize my left hand was clenched into a fist, nails biting into my bandaged palm, until Edward took it and gently smoothed my fingers out. It's going to be fine, Bella, he promised. We've got skill, training, and surprise on our side. It will be over very soon. If I didn't truly believe that, I would be down there now, and you'd be here chained to a tree or something along those lines. Alice is so small, I moaned. He chuckled. That might be a problem, if it were possible for someone to catch her. Seth started to whimper. What's wrong? I demanded. He's just angry that he's stuck here with us. He knows the pack kept him out of the action to protect him. He's salivating to join them. I scowled in Seth's general direction. The newborns have reached the end of the trail. It worked like a charm. Jasper's a genius. They've caught the scent of the ones in the meadow. They're splitting into 2 groups now, as Alice said. Edward murmured, his eyes focused on something far away. Sam's taking us around to head off the ambush party. He was so intent on what he was hearing that he used the pack plural. Suddenly he looked down at me. Breathe, Bella. I struggled to do what he asked. I could hear Seth's heavy panting just outside the tent wall. I tried to keep my lungs on the same even pace so that I wouldn't hyperventilate. The first group is in the clearing. We can hear the fighting. my teeth locked together. He laughed once. We can hear Emmett. He's enjoying himself. I made myself take another breath with Seth. The second group's getting ready. They aren't paying attention. They haven't heard us yet. Edward growled. What? I gasped. They're talking about you. His teeth clenched together. They're supposed to make sure you don't escape. Nice move, Leah. She's quite fast, he murmured in approval. One of the newborns caught our scent, and Leah took him down before he could even turn. Sam's helping her finish him off. Paul and Jacob got another one, but the others are on the defensive now. They have no idea what to make of us. Both sides are fainting. No, let Sam lead. Stay out of the way, he muttered. Separate them. Don't let them protect each other's backs. Seth whined. That's better. Drive them toward the clearing. Edward approved. His body was shifting unconsciously as he watched, tensing for moves he would have made. His hand still held mine. I twisted my fingers through his. At least he wasn't down there. The sudden absence of sound was the only warning. The deep rush of Seth's breathing cut off, and as I'd paced my breaths with his, I noticed. I stopped breathing too frightened to even make my lungs work as I realized that Edward had frozen into a block of ice beside me. Oh no. 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 Who had been lost? Theirs or ours? Mine. All mine. What was my loss? So quickly that I wasn't exactly sure how it happened. I was on my feet, and the tent was collapsing in ragged shreds around me. Had Edward ripped our way out? Why? I blinked, shocked into the brilliant light. Seth was all I could see, right beside us, his face only 6 inches from Edward's. They stared at each other with absolute concentration for one infinite second. The sun shattered off Edward's skin and sent sparkles dancing across Seth's fur. And then Edward whispered urgently, Go, Seth. The huge wolf wheeled and disappeared into the forest shadows. Had 2 entire seconds passed, it felt like hours. I was terrified, to the point of nausea by the knowledge that something horrible had gone awry in the clearing. I opened my mouth to demand that Edward take me there, and do it now. They needed him, and they needed me. If I had to bleed to save them, I would do it. I would die to do it, like the third wife. I had no silver dagger in my hand, but I would find a way. Before I could get the first syllable out, I felt as if I was being flung through the air, but Edward's hands never let go of me. I was only being moved so quickly that the sensation was like falling sideways. I found myself with my back pressed against the sheer cliff face. Edward stood in front of me, holding a posture that I knew at once. Relief washed through my mind, at the same time that my stomach dropped through the soles of my feet. I'd misunderstood. Relief. Nothing had gone wrong in the clearing. Horror. The crisis was here. Edward held a defensive position, half crouched, his arms extended slightly that I recognized with sickening certainty. The rock at my back could have been the ancient brick walls of the Italian alley where he had stood between me and the black-cloaked Volturi warriors. Something was coming for us. Who? I whispered. The words came through his teeth in a snarl that was louder than I expected. Too loud. It meant that it was far too late to hide. We were trapped, and it didn't matter who heard his answer. "Victoria," he said, spitting the word, making it a curse. "She's not alone. She crossed my scent, following the newborns in to watch. She never meant to fight with them. She made a spur-of-the-moment decision to find me, guessing you would be wherever I was. She was right. You were right. It was always Victoria." She was close enough that he could hear her thoughts. Relief again. If it had been the Volturi, we were both dead. But with Victoria, it didn't have to be both. Edward could survive this. He was a good fighter, as good as Jasper. If she didn't bring too many others, he could fight his way out back to his family. Edward was faster than anyone. He could make it. I was so glad he'd sent Seth away. Of course, there was no one Seth could run to for help. Victoria had timed her decision perfectly, but at least Seth was safe. I couldn't see the huge sandy wolf in my head when I thought his name. Just the gangly 15-year-old boy. Edward's body shifted, only infinitesimally, but it told me where to look. I stared at the black shadows of the forest. It was like having my nightmares walk forward to greet me. 2 vampires edged slowly into the small opening of our camp, eyes intent, missing nothing. They glistened like diamonds in the sun. I could barely look at the blonde boy. Yes, he was just a boy, though he was muscular and tall. Maybe my age when he was changed. His eyes, a more vivid red than I had ever seen before, could not hold mine. Though he was the closest to Edward, the nearest danger, I could not watch him. Because a few feet to the side, and a few feet back, Victoria was staring at me. Her orange hair was brighter than I'd remembered, more like a flame. There was no wind here, but the fire around her face seemed to shimmer slightly as if it were alive. Her eyes were black with thirst. She did not smile, as she always had in my nightmares. Her lips were pressed into a tight line. There was a striking feline quality to the way she held her coiled body, a lioness waiting for an opening to spring. Her restless, wild gaze flickered between Edward and me, but never rested on him for more than half a second. She could not keep her eyes from my face any more than I could keep mine from hers. Tension rolled off of her, nearly visible in the air. I could feel the desire, the all-consuming passion that held her in its grip, almost as if I could hear her thoughts too. I knew what she was thinking. She was so close to what she wanted. The focus of her whole existence for more than a year now was just so close. My death. Her plan was as obvious as it was practical. The big blonde boy would attack Edward. As soon as Edward was sufficiently distracted, Victoria would finish me. It would be quick. She had no time for games here. But it would be thorough. Something that it would be impossible to recover from. Something that even vampire venom could not repair. She'd have to stop my heart. Perhaps a hand shoved through my chest, crushing it. Something along those lines. My heart beat furiously, loudly, as if to make her target more obvious. An immense distance away from far across the black forest, a wolf's howl echoed in the still air. With Seth gone, there was no way to interpret the sound. The blonde boy looked at Victoria from the corner of his eye, waiting on her command. He was young in more ways than one. I guessed from his brilliant crimson irises that he couldn't have been a vampire for very long. He would be strong, but inept. Edward would know how to fight him. Edward would survive. Victoria jerked her chin toward Edward, wordlessly ordering the boy forward. "Riley," Edward said in a soft, pleading voice. The blonde boy froze, his red eyes widening. "She's lying to you, Riley," Edward told him. "Listen to me. She's lying to you just like she lied to the others who are dying now in the clearing. You know that she's lied to them, that she had you lie to them, that neither of you were ever going to help them. Is it so hard to believe that she's lied to you too?" Confusion swept across Riley's face. Edward shifted a few inches to the side, and Riley automatically compensated with an adjustment of his own. "She doesn't love you, Riley." Edward's soft voice was compelling, almost hypnotic. "She never has. She loved someone named James. And you're no more than a tool to her." When he said James's name, Victoria's lips pulled back in a teeth-baring grimace. Her eyes stayed locked on me. Riley cast a frantic glance in her direction. "Riley," Edward said. Riley automatically refocused on Edward. "She knows that I will kill you, Riley. She wants you to die so that she doesn't have to keep up the pretense anymore. Yes, you've seen that, haven't you? You've read the reluctance in her eyes, suspected a false note in her promises. You were right. She's never wanted you. Every kiss, every touch was a lie." Edward moved again, moved a few inches toward the boy, a few inches away from me. Victoria's gaze zeroed in on the gap between us. It would take her less than a second to kill me. She only needed the tiniest margin of opportunity. Slower this time, Riley repositioned himself. "You don't have to die," Edward promised, his eyes holding the boy's. "There are other ways to live than the way she's shown you. It's not all lies and blood, Riley. You can walk away right now. You don't have to die for her lies." Edward slid his feet forward and to the side. There was a foot of space between us now. Riley circled too far, overcompensating this time. Victoria leaned forward onto the balls of her feet. "Last chance, Riley," Edward whispered. Riley's face was desperate as he looked to Victoria for answers. "He's the liar, Riley," Victoria said, and my mouth fell open in shock at the sound of her voice. "I told you about their mind tricks. You know I love only you." Her voice was not the strong, wild, cat-like growl I would have put with her face and stance. It was soft. It was high. A babyish soprano tinkling. The kind of voice that went with blonde curls and pink bubblegum. It made no sense coming through her bared, glistening teeth. Riley's jaw tightened, and he squared his shoulders. His eyes emptied. There was no more confusion. No more suspicion. There was no thought at all. He tensed himself to attack. Victoria's body seemed to be trembling. She was so tightly wound. Her fingers were ready claws, waiting for Edward to move just one more inch away from me. The snarl came from none of them. A mammoth tan shape flew through the center of the opening, throwing Riley to the ground. "No," Victoria cried, her baby voice shrill with disbelief. 1.5 yards in front of me, the huge wolf ripped and tore at the blonde vampire beneath him. Something white and hard smacked into the rocks by my feet. I cringed away from it. Victoria did not spare one glance for the boy she'd just pledged her love to. Her eyes were still on me, filled with a disappointment so ferocious that she looked deranged. "No," she said again through her teeth, as Edward started to move toward her, blocking her path to me. Riley was on his feet again, looking misshapen and haggard, but he was able to fling a vicious kick into Seth's shoulder. I heard the bone crunch. Seth backed off and started to circle, limping. Riley had his arms out, ready, though he seemed to be missing part of one hand. Only a few yards away from that fight, Edward and Victoria were dancing. Not quite circling, because Edward was not allowing her to position herself closer to me. She sashayed back, moving from side to side, trying to find a hole in his defense. He shadowed her footwork lithely, stalking her with perfect concentration. He began to move just a fraction of a second before she moved, reading her intentions in her thoughts. Seth lunged at Riley from the side, and something tore with a hideous grating screech. Another heavy white chunk flew into the forest with a thud. Riley roared in fury, and Seth skipped back, amazingly light on his feet for his size, as Riley took a swipe at him with one mangled hand. Victoria was weaving through the tree trunks at the far end of the little opening now. She was torn, her feet pulling her towards safety, while her eyes yearned toward me as if I were a magnet, reeling her in. I could see the burning desire to kill, warring with her survival instinct. Edward could see that too. "Don't go, Victoria," he murmured in that same hypnotic tone as before. "You'll never get another chance like this." She showed her teeth and hissed at him, but she seemed unable to move farther away from me. "You can always run later," Edward purred. "Plenty of time for that. It's what you do, isn't it? It's why James kept you around. Useful if you like to play deadly games. A partner with an uncanny instinct for escaping. He shouldn't have left you. He could have used your skills when we caught up to him in Phoenix." A snarl ripped from between her lips. "That's all you ever were to him, though. Silly to waste so much energy avenging someone who had less affection for you than a hunter for his mount. You were never more than a convenience to him. I would know." Edward's lips pulled up one side as he tapped his temple. With a strangled screech, Victoria darted out of the trees again, fainting to the side. Edward responded, and the dance began again. Just then, Riley's fist caught Seth's flank, and a low yelp coughed out of Seth's throat. Seth backed away, his shoulders twitching as if he were trying to shake off the pain. "Please," I wanted to plead with Riley, but I couldn't find the muscles to make my mouth open, to pull the air up from my lungs. "Please, he's just a child." Why hadn't Seth run away? Why didn't he run now? Riley was closing the distance between them again, driving Seth toward the cliff face beside me. Victoria was suddenly interested in her partner's fate. I could see her, from the corner of her eyes, judge the distance between Riley and me. Seth snapped at Riley, forcing him back again, and Victoria hissed. Seth wasn't limping anymore. His circling took him within inches of Edward. His tail brushed Edward's back, and Victoria's eyes bulged. "No, he won't turn on me," Edward said, answering the question in Victoria's head. He used her distraction to slide closer. "You provided us with a common enemy. You allied us." She clenched her teeth, trying to keep her focus on Edward alone. "Look more closely, Victoria," he murmured, pulling at the threads of her concentration. "Is he really so much like the monster James tracked across Siberia?" Her eyes popped wide open, and then began flickering wildly from Edward to Seth to me, around and around. "Not the same," she snarled in her little girl soprano. "Impossible." "Nothing is impossible," Edward murmured, voice velvet soft as he moved another inch closer to her. "Except what you want. You'll never touch her." She shook her head, fast and jerky, fighting his diversions, and tried to duck around him, but he was in place to block her as soon as she'd thought of the plan. Her face contorted in frustration, and then she shifted lower into her crouch, a lioness again, and stalked deliberately forward. Victoria was no inexperienced, instinct-driven newborn. She was lethal. Even I could tell the difference between her and Riley. And I knew that Seth wouldn't have lasted so long if he'd been fighting this vampire. Edward shifted too as they closed on each other, and it was lion versus lioness. The dance increased in tempo. It was like Alice and Jasper in the meadow, a blurred spiraling of movement, only this dance was not as perfectly choreographed. Sharp crunches and crackings reverberated off the cliff face whenever someone slipped in their formation. But they were moving too fast for me to see who was making the mistakes. Riley was distracted by the violent ballet, his eyes anxious for his partner. Seth struck, crunching off another small piece of the vampire. Riley bellowed and launched a massive backhand blow that caught Seth full in his broad chest. Seth's huge body soared 10 feet and crashed into the rocky wall over my head with a force that seemed to shake the whole peak. I heard the breath whoosh from his lungs, and I ducked out of the way as he rebounded off the stone and collapsed on the ground a few feet in front of me. A low whimper escaped through Seth's teeth. Sharp fragments of grey stone showered down on my head, scratching my exposed skin. A jagged spike of rock rolled down my right arm, and I caught it reflexively. My fingers clenched around the long shard as my own survival instincts kicked in. Since there was no chance of flight, my body, not caring how ineffectual the gesture was, prepared for a fight. Adrenaline jolted through my veins. I knew the brace was cutting into my palm. I knew the crack in my knuckle was protesting. I knew it, but I could not feel the pain. Behind Riley, all I could see was the twisting flame of Victoria's hair and a blur of white. The increasingly frequent metallic snaps and tears, the gasps and shocked hissings, made it clear that the dance was turning deadly for someone. But which someone? Riley lurched toward me, his red eyes brilliant with fury, He glared at the limp mountain of sand-colored fur between us, and his hands, mangled, broken hands, curled into talons. His mouth opened, widened, his teeth glistening as he prepared to rip out Seth's throat. A second kick of adrenaline hit, like an electric shock, and everything was suddenly very clear. Both fights were too close. Seth was about to lose his, and I had no idea if Edward was winning or losing. They needed help, a distraction, something to give them an edge. My hand gripped the stone spike so tightly that a support in the brace snapped. Was I strong enough? Was I brave enough? How hard could I shove the rough stone into my body? Would this buy Seth enough time to get back on his feet? Would he heal fast enough for my sacrifice to do him any good? I raked the point of the shard up my arm, yanking my thick sweater back to expose the skin, and then pressed the sharp tip to the crease of my elbow. I already had a long scar there from my last birthday. That night, my flowing blood had been enough to catch every vampire's attention, to freeze them all in place for an instant. I prayed it would work that way again. I steeled myself and sucked in one deep breath. Victoria was distracted by the sound of my gasp. Her eyes holding still for one tiny portion of a second met mine. Fury and curiosity mingled strangely in her expression. I wasn't sure how I heard the low sound, with all the other noises echoing off the stone wall and hammering inside my head. My own heartbeat should have been enough to drown it out. But in the split second that I stared into Victoria's eyes, I thought I heard a familiar, exasperated sigh. In that same short second, the dance broke violently apart. It happened so quickly that it was over before I could follow the sequence of events. I tried to catch up in my head. Victoria had flown out of the blurred formation and smashed into a tall spruce about halfway up the tree. She dropped back to the earth, already crouched to spring. Simultaneously, Edward, all but invisible with speed, had twisted backward and caught the unsuspecting Riley by the arm. It had looked like Edward planted his foot against Riley's back and heaved. The little campsite was filled with Riley's piercing shriek of agony. At the same time, Seth leapt to his feet, cutting off most of my view. But I could still see Victoria, and though she looked oddly deformed, as if she were unable to straighten up completely, I could see the smile I'd been dreaming of flash across her wild face. Something small and white whistled through the air and collided with her mid-flight. The impact sounded like an explosion, and it threw her against another tree. This one snapped in half. She landed on her feet again, crouched and ready, but Edward was already in place. Relief swelled in my heart when I saw that he stood straight and perfect. Victoria kicked something aside with a flick of her bare foot, the missile that had crippled her attack. It rolled toward me, and I realized what it was. My stomach lurched. The fingers were still twitching, grasping at blades of grass. Riley's arm began to drag itself mindlessly across the ground. Seth was circling Riley again, and now Riley was retreating. He backed away from the advancing werewolf. his face rigid with pain. He raised his one arm defensively. Seth rushed Riley, and the vampire was clearly off balance. I saw Seth sink his teeth into Riley's shoulder and tear, jumping back again. With an ear-splitting metallic screech, Riley lost his other arm. Seth shook his head, flinging the arm into the woods. The broken, hissing noise that came through Seth's teeth sounded like snickering. Riley screamed out a tortured plea. "Victoria!" Victoria did not even flinch to the sound of her name. Her eyes did not flicker once toward her partner. Seth launched himself forward with the force of a wrecking ball. The thrust carried both Seth and Riley into the trees, where the metallic screeching was matched by Riley's screams. Screams that abruptly cut off, while the sounds of rock being ripped to shreds continued. Though she spared Riley no farewell glance, Victoria seemed to realize that she was on her own. She began to back away from Edward, frenzied disappointment blazing in her eyes. She threw me one short, agonized stare of longing, and then she started to retreat faster. "No," Edward crooned, his voice seductive. "Stay, just a little longer." She wheeled and flew toward the refuge of the forest, like an arrow from a bow. But Edward was faster, a bullet from a gun. He caught her unprotected back at the edge of the trees, and with one last simple step, the dance was over. Edward's mouth brushed once across her neck, like a caress. The squealing clamor coming from Seth's efforts covered every other noise. There was no discernible sound to make the image one of violence. He could have been kissing her. And then, the fiery tangle of hair was no longer connected to the rest of her body. The shivering orange waves fell to the ground and bounced once before rolling toward the trees. I forced my eyes, that were frozen wide open with shock, to move, so that I could not examine too closely the oval object wrapped in tendrils of shivering fiery hair. Edward was in motion again, swift and coolly businesslike. He dismembered the headless corpse. I could not go to him. I could not make my feet respond. They were bolted to the stone beneath them. But I scrutinized his every action minutely, looking for any evidence that he had been harmed. My heart slowed to a healthier rhythm when I found nothing. He was lithe and graceful as ever. I couldn't even see a tear in his clothes. He did not look at me, where I stood frozen to the cliff wall, horrified, while he piled the quivering, twitching limbs and then covered them with dry pine needles. He still did not meet my shocked gaze as he darted into the forest after Seth. I didn't have time to recover before both he and Seth were back, Edward with his arms full of Riley. Seth was carrying a large chunk, the torso, in his mouth. They added their burden to the pile, and Edward pulled a silver rectangle from his pocket. He flipped open the butane lighter and held the flame to the dry tinder. It caught at once. Long tongues of orange fire licked rapidly across the pyre. "Get every piece," Edward said in a low aside to Seth. Together, the vampire and the werewolf scoured the campsite, occasionally tossing small lumps of white stone into the blaze. Seth handled the pieces with his teeth. My brain wasn't working well enough for me to understand why he didn't change back to a form with hands. Edward kept his eyes on his work. And then they were done. And the raging fire was sending a pillar of choking purple toward the sky. The thick smoke curled up slowly, looking more solid than it should. It smelled like burning incense, and the scent was uncomfortable. It was heavy, too strong. Seth made that snickering sound again, deep in his chest. A smile flickered across Edward's tense face. Edward stretched out his arm, his hand curled into a fist. Seth grinned, revealing the long row of dagger teeth, and bumped his nose against Edward's hand. "Nice teamwork," Edward murmured. Seth coughed a laugh. Then Edward took a deep breath and turned slowly to face me. I did not understand his expression. His eyes were as wary as if I were another enemy. More than wary. They were afraid. Yet he'd shown no fear at all when he'd faced Victoria and Riley. My mind was stuck, stunned, and useless as my body. I stared at him, bewildered. "Bella, love," he said in his softest tone, walking toward me with exaggerated slowness. His hands held up, palms forward. Dazed as I was, it reminded me oddly of a suspect approaching a policeman, showing that he wasn't armed. "Bella, can you drop the rock, please? Carefully. Don't hurt yourself." I'd forgotten all about my crude weapon, though I realized now that I was grasping it so hard that my knuckle was screaming in protest. Was it re-broken? Carlyle would put me in a cast for sure this time. Edward hesitated a few feet from me, his hands still in the air, his eyes still fearful. It took me a few long seconds to remember how to move my fingers. Then the rock clattered to the ground, while my hand stayed frozen in the same position. Edward relaxed slightly when my hands were empty, but came no closer. "You don't have to be afraid, Bella," Edward murmured. "You're safe. I won't hurt you." The mystifying promise only confused me further. I stared at him like an imbecile, trying to understand. "It's going to be all right, Bella. I know you're frightened now, but it's over. No one is going to hurt you. I won't touch you. I won't hurt you," he said again. My eyes blinked furiously and I found my voice. "Why do you keep saying that?" I took an uneasy step toward him, and he leaned away from my advance. "What's wrong?" I whispered. "What do you mean?" "Are you?" His golden eyes were suddenly as confused as I felt. "Aren't you afraid of me?" "Afraid of you? Why?" I staggered forward another step, and then tripped over something, my own feet probably. Edward caught me, and I buried my face in his chest and started to sob. Bella, I'm so sorry. It's over. It's over." "I'm fine," I gasped. "I'm okay. I'm just freaking out. Give me a minute." His arms tightened around me. I'm so sorry, he murmured again and again. I clung to him until I could breathe, and then I was kissing him. His chest, his shoulder, his neck, every part of him that I could reach. Slowly my brain started to work again. Are you okay? I demanded between kisses. Did she hurt you at all? I am absolutely fine, he promised, burying his face in my hair. Seth? Edward chuckled. More than fine. Very pleased with himself, in fact. The others? Alice, Esme, the wolves? All fine. It's over there, too. It went just as smoothly as I promised. We got the worst of it here. I let myself absorb that for a moment, let it sink in and settle in my head. My family and my friends were safe. Victoria was never coming after me again. It was over. We were all going to be fine. But I couldn't completely take in the good news while I was still so confused. Tell me why, I insisted. Why did you think I would be afraid of you? I'm sorry, he said, apologizing yet again. For what, I had no idea. So sorry. I didn't want you to see that. See me like that. I know I must have terrified you. I had to think about that for another minute. About the hesitant way he'd approached me, his hands in the air like I was going to run if he moved too fast. Seriously? I finally asked. You... what? Thought you'd scared me off? I snorted. Snorting was good. A voice couldn't tremble or break during a snort. It sounded impressively offhand. He put his hand under my chin and tilted my head back to read my face. Bella, He hesitated and then forced the words out. I just beheaded and dismembered a sentient creature not 20 yards from you. That doesn't bother you. He frowned at me. I shrugged. Shrugging was good too. Very blasé. Not really. I was only afraid that you and Seth were going to get hurt. I wanted to help, but there's only so much I can do. His suddenly livid expression made my voice fade out. Yes, he said, his tone clipped. Your little stunt with the rock. You know that you nearly gave me a heart attack. Not the easiest thing to do, that. His furious glower made it hard to answer. I wanted to help. Seth was hurt. Seth was only feigning that he was hurt, Bella. It was a trick. And then you... He shook his head, unable to finish. Seth couldn't see what you were doing, so I had to step in. Seth's a bit disgruntled that he can't claim a single-handed defeat now. Seth was faking? Edward nodded sternly. Oh. We both looked at Seth, who was studiously ignoring us, watching the flames. Smugness radiated from every hair in his fur. Well, I didn't know that, I said, on the offense now. And it's not easy being the only helpless person around. Just you wait till I'm a vampire. I'm not going to be sitting on the sidelines next time. A dozen emotions flitted across his face before he settled on being amused. Next time? Did you anticipate another war soon? With my luck, who knows? He rolled his eyes, but I could see that he was flying. The relief was making us both lightheaded. It was over. Or was it? Hold on. Didn't you say something before? I flinched, remembering what exactly it had been before. What was I going to say to Jacob? My splintered heart throbbed out a painful, aching beat. It was hard to believe. Almost impossible. But the hardest part of this day was not behind me. And then I soldiered on. About a complication? And Alice needing to nail down the schedule for Sam? You said it was going to be close. What was going to be close? Edward's eyes flickered back to Seth, and they exchanged a loaded glance. Well, I asked. It's nothing, really, Edward said quickly. But we do need to be on our way. He started to pull me into place on his back, but I stiffened and drew away. Define nothing. Edward took my face between his palms. We only have a minute, so don't panic, all right? I told you that you had no reason to be afraid. Trust me on that, please. I nodded, trying to hide the sudden terror. How much more could I handle before I collapsed? No reason to be afraid. Got it. He pursed his lips for a second, deciding what to say. And then he glanced abruptly at Seth, as if the wolf had called him. What's she doing? Edward asked. Seth whined. It was an anxious, uneasy sound. It made the hair on the back of my neck rise. Everything was dead silent for one endless second. And then Edward gasped. No, and one of his hands flew out as if to grab something that I couldn't see. Don't. A spasm rocked through Seth's body, a howl, blistering with agony, ripped from his lungs. Edward fell to his knees at the exact same moment, gripping the sides of his head with two hands, his face furrowed in pain. I screamed, once in bewildered terror, and dropped to my knees beside him. Stupidly, I tried to pull his hands from his face, my palms clammy with sweat. They slid off his marble skin. Edward! Edward! His eyes focused on me. With obvious effort, he pulled his clenched teeth apart. It's okay. We're going to be fine. He broke off and winced again. What's happening? I cried out while Seth howled in anguish. We're fine. We're going to be okay, Edward gasped. Sam, help him. And I realized, in that instant, when he said Sam's name, that he was not speaking of himself and Seth. No unseen force was attacking them. This time, the crisis was not here. He was using the pack plural. I'd burned through all my adrenaline. My body had nothing left. I sagged, and Edward caught me before I could hit the rocks. He sprang to his feet, me in his arms. Seth, Edward shouted. Seth was crouched, still tensed in agony, looking as if he meant to launch himself into the forest. No, Edward ordered. You go straight home. Now, as fast as you can. Seth whimpered, shaking his great head from side to side. Seth, trust me. The huge wolf stared into Edward's agonized eyes for one long second, and then he straightened up and flew into the trees, disappearing like a ghost. Edward cradled me tightly against his chest, and then we were also hurtling through the shadowy forest, taking a different path than the wolf. Edward, I fought to force the words through my constricted throat. What happened, Edward? What happened to Sam? Where are we going? What's happening? We have to go back to the clearing, he told me in a low voice. We knew there was a good probability of this happening. Earlier this morning, Alice saw it and passed it through Sam to Seth. The Volturi decided it was time to intercede. The Volturi. Too much. My mind refused to make sense of the words, pretended it couldn't understand. The trees jolted past us. He was running downhill so fast that it felt as if we were plummeting, falling out of control. Don't panic. They aren't coming for us. It's just the normal contingent of the guard that usually cleans up this kind of mess. Nothing momentous. They're merely doing their job. Of course, they seem to have timed their arrival very carefully, which leads me to believe that no one in Italy would mourn if these newborns had reduced the size of the Cullen family. The words came through his teeth, hard and bleak. I'll know for sure what they were thinking when they get to the clearing. Is that why we're going back? I whispered. Could I handle this? Images of flowing black robes crept into my unwilling mind. I flinched away from them. I was close to a breaking point. It's part of the reason. Mostly it'll be safer for us to present a united front at this point. They have no reason to harass us, but Jane's with them. If she thought we were alone somewhere away from the others, it might tempt her. Like Victoria, Jane will probably guess that I'm with you. Dimitri, of course, is with her. He could find me if Jane asked him to. I didn't want to think that name. I didn't want to see that blindingly exquisite childlike face in my head. A strange sound came out of my throat. Shh, Bella, shh, it's gonna be fine. Alice can see that. Alice could see? But then where were the wolves? Where was the pack? The pack? They had to leave quickly. The Volturi do not honor truces with werewolves. I could hear my breathing get faster, but I couldn't control it. I started to gasp. I swear they will be fine, Edward promised me. The Volturi won't recognize the scent. They won't realize the wolves are here. This isn't a species they are familiar with. The pack will be fine. I couldn't process his explanation. My concentration was ripped to shred by my fears. We're going to be fine, he had said before, and Seth howling in agony. Edward had avoided my first question, distracted me with the Volturi. I was very close to the edge, just clinging by my fingertips. The trees were a racing blur that flowed around him like jade waters. What happened? I whispered again. Before, when Seth was howling, when you were hurt. Edward hesitated. Edward, tell me. It was all over, he whispered. I could barely hear him over the wind that his speed created. The wolves didn't count their half. They thought they had them all. Of course, Alice couldn't see. What happened? One of the newborns was hiding. Leah found him. She was being stupid, cocky, trying to prove something. She engaged him alone. Leah? I repeated, and I was too weak to feel shame for the relief that flooded through me. Is she gonna be okay? Leah wasn't hurt, Edward mumbled. I stared at him for a long second. Sam, help him, Edward had gasped. Him, not her. We're almost there, Edward said, and he stared at a fixed point in the sky. Automatically, my eyes followed his. There was a dark purple cloud hanging low over the trees. A cloud. But it was so abnormally sunny. No, not a cloud. I recognized the thick column of smoke, just like the one at our campsite. Edward, I said, my voice nearly inaudible. "Edward, someone got hurt?" I'd heard Seth's agony, seen the torture in Edward's face. "Yes," he whispered. "Who?" I asked, though of course I already knew the answer. Of course I did. Of course. The trees were slowing around us as we came to our destination. It took him a long moment to answer me. "Jacob," he said. I was able to nod once. "Of course," I whispered. And then I slipped off the edge I was clinging to inside my head. Everything went black. I was first aware of the cool hands touching me. More than one pair of hands, arms holding me. A palm curved to fit my cheek, fingers stroking my forehead, and more fingers pressed lightly into my wrist. Then I was aware of the voices. They were just a humming at first, and then they grew in volume and clarity like someone was turning up a radio. "Carlisle, it's been 5 minutes," Edward's voice, anxious. "She'll come around when she's ready, Edward." Carlisle's voice, always calm and sure. "She's had too much to deal with today. Let her mind protect itself." But my mind was not protected. It was trapped in the knowledge that had not left me, even in unconsciousness, the pain that was part of the blackness. I felt totally disconnected from my body, like I was caged in some small corner of my head, no longer at the controls. But I couldn't do anything about it. I couldn't think. The agony was too strong for that. There was no escape from it. Jacob. Jacob. No, no, no. "Alice, how long do we have?" Edward demanded, his voice still tense. Carlisle's soothing words had not helped. From farther away, Alice's voice, brightly chipper. "Another 5 minutes, and Bella will open her eyes in 37 seconds. I wouldn't doubt that she can hear us now." "Bella? Honey?" This was Esme's soft, comforting voice. "Can you hear me? You're safe now, dear." Yes. I was safe. Did that really matter? Then cool lips were at my ear, and Edward was speaking the words that allowed me to escape from the torture that had me caged inside my head. "He's going to live, Bella. Jacob Black is healing as I speak. He'll be fine." As the pain and dread eased, I found my way back to my body. My eyelids fluttered. "Oh, Bella," Edward sighed in relief, and his lips touched mine. "Edward," I whispered. "Yes, I'm here." I got my lids to open, and I stared into warm gold. "Jacob's okay?" I asked. "Yes," he promised. I watched his eyes carefully for some sign that he was placating me, but they were perfectly clear. "I examined him myself," Carlisle said then. I turned my head to find his face, only a few feet away. Carlisle's expression was serious and reassuring at the same time. It was impossible to doubt him. His life was not in any danger. He was healing at an incredible rate, though his injuries were extensive enough that it will still be a few days before he's back to normal, even if the rate of repair holds steady. As soon as we're done here, I will do what I can to help him. Sam is trying to get him to phase back to his human form. That will make treating him easier. Carlyle smiled slightly. I've never been to veterinarian school. What happened to him? I whispered. How bad are his injuries? Carlyle's face was serious again. Another wolf was in trouble. Leah, I breathed. Yes. He knocked her out of the way, but he didn't have time to defend himself. The newborn got his arms around him. Most of the bones on the right half of his body were shattered. I flinched. Sam and Paul got there in time. He was already improving when they took him back to La Push. He'll be back to normal? I asked. Yes, Bella. He won't have any permanent damage. I took a deep breath. 3 minutes, Alice said quietly. I struggled, trying to get vertical. Edward realized what I was doing and helped me to my feet. I stared at the scene in front of me. The Cullens stood in a loose semicircle around the bonfire. There were hardly any flames visible, just the thick purple-black smoke, hovering like a disease against the bright grass. Jasper stood closest to the solid-seeming haze, in its shadow so that his skin did not glitter brilliantly in the sun the way the others did. He had his back to me, his shoulders tense, his arms slightly extended. There was something there, in his shadow, something he crouched over with wary intensity. I was too numb to feel more than a mild shock when I realized what it was. There were 8 vampires in the clearing. The girl was curled into a small ball beside the flames, her arms wrapped around her legs. She was very young, younger than me. She looked maybe 15, dark-haired and slight. Her eyes were focused on me, and the irises were a shocking, brilliant red, much brighter than Riley's, almost glowing. They wheeled wildly, out of control. Edward saw my bewildered expression. She surrendered, he told me quietly. That's one I've never seen before. Only Carlyle would think of offering. Jasper doesn't approve. I couldn't tear my gaze away from the scene beside the fire. Jasper was rubbing absently at his left forearm. Is Jasper all right? I whispered. He's fine. The venom stings. He was bitten? I asked, horrified. He was trying to be everywhere at once. Trying to make sure Alice had nothing to do, actually. Alice doesn't need anyone's help. Edward shook his head. Alice grimaced toward her true love. Overprotective fool. The young female suddenly threw her head back like an animal and wailed shrilly. Jasper growled at her, and she cringed back, but her fingers dug into the ground like claws, and her head whipped back and forth in anguish. Jasper took a step toward her, slipping deeper into his crouch. Edward moved with overdone casualness, turning our bodies so that he was between the girl and me. I peeked around his arm to watch the thrashing girl and Jasper. Carlyle was at Jasper's side in an instant. He put a restraining hand on his most recent son's arm. Have you changed your mind, young one? Carlyle asked, calm as ever. We don't want to destroy you, but we will if you can't control yourself. How can you stand it? The girl groaned in a high, clear voice. I want her. Her bright crimson irises focused on Edward, through him, beyond him to me, and her nails ripped through the hard soil again. "You must stand it," Carlyle told her gravely. "You must exercise control. It is possible, and it is the only thing that will save you now." The girl clutched her dirt-encrusted hands around her head, yowling quietly. "Shouldn't we move away from her?" I whispered, tugging on Edward's arm. The girl's lips pulled back over her teeth when she heard my voice, her expression one of torment. "We have to stay here," Edward murmured. "They are coming to the north end of the clearing. Now." My heart burst into a sprint as I scanned the clearing, but I couldn't see anything past the thick pall of smoke. After a second of fruitless searching, my gaze crept back to the young female vampire. She was still watching me, her eyes half mad. I met the girl's stare for a long moment. Chin-length dark hair framed her face, which was alabaster pale. It was hard to tell if her features were beautiful, twisted as they were by rage and thirst. The feral red eyes were dominant, hard to look away from. She glared at me, viciously, shuddering and writhing every few seconds. I stared at her, mesmerized, wondering if I were looking into a mirror of my future. Then Carlyle and Jasper began to back toward the rest of us. Emmett, Rosalie, and Esme all converged hastily around where Edward stood with Alice and me. A united front, as Edward had said, with me at the heart, in the safest place. I tore my attention away from the wild girl to search for the approaching monsters. And that is where we close the book tonight on this episode of Down to Sleep. So that is the end of the chapter, and there is still more Eclipse to come. Thank you for joining me. I hope that you enjoyed this reading. There was a couple of moments there where I felt tempted to leave you on a cliffhanger, but I thought, we're so close to episode 400, and you've been so good recently, let's do a slightly longer episode and finish the fight off. I'm so good to you, I know. This was a great episode. Again, can I just say that I've always been on Team Edward, and that every time Edward is a great boyfriend and a great fiancé and a great partner and a great man, I feel vindicated. I feel proud of him. And this episode was no different. Not at all what I expected. His reaction to Jacob's manipulation, Bella's kind of not so reluctant kissing of Jacob and her feelings, just completely accepting, understanding of what is human. In this strange way, it's almost kind of melancholic for him because he so desperately wants her to stay human, that these are qualities that he admires, that he doesn't see in himself or his kin. So for her and Jacob to exhibit them, as it says, is admirable almost. Not just the playing dirty, but just the kind of the error of it, them being young, them being human. So impressed with how understanding he was of the whole affair, honestly. I expected fireworks, but then I forget that he is 100-something years old and has a lot of experience and a lot of wisdom and a lot of patience, you know. It is the kind of thing that comes with age, these kind of high school silly things that we used to get worked up about that suddenly just become a shrug and a, well, isn't that funny, you know, oh, that thing happened, I guess, oh well, you know, this thing happens, let's move on. And I thought that was really some great writing and character work for Edward, And I liked Bella's kind of reaction to it and wanting to be chastised and everything else. Great. One of my favorite parts so far, probably. And then the fight, the action, probably one of our longest and most action-filled beats that have been so far. I can't really remember, other than the fight with James at the end of the first book, if there are any other sort of big fight scenes. This one felt like it went on for longer than the others, as you would expect, no less, with it being Victoria, who has been a very big villain through the entire series so far, in the shadows, a constant threat, now ended, and Edward's the one to do it, so we'll see what happens with that next time. There's still a couple of chapters to go, so where will it go next? Victoria gone. The excitement of the Volturi now coming in to sort of end this book in the next couple of chapters with. And also Jacob doing something stupid, brave but stupid, and getting himself hurt. Genuinely, in those moments, I could feel like Bella's emotions toward it. And I know we go up and down with Jacob, and we kind of read him to filth in previous episodes, but him being hurt in those moments was really quite emotional, and kind of seeing that from Bella's side, how much she cares for him. So it's just one of those things where when someone gets hurt or things change and you kind of forgive everything that they've done, did, said, and you just want them to be okay. So that was some pretty nice writing, I thought. And I'm excited to see where it goes next. So thank you for joining me. And until next time, I hope you have a wonderful weekend, a great start to the week. And I'll see you in the next one. Thank you. And good night.